I'm so high, I can't lie, mesmerized by you.